The infamous 40-gallon breeder tank. Can you house an Ackie in one? Well, we're going to talk about that today, and when, in fact, you actually can. So let's get to it, guys. Hey, guys, how's it going? You know, it's the beginning of a new year. I'll be completely bald. Yellow Ackie, Reptile. First and foremost, guys, no, a 40-gallon breeder tank is not something long-term you want to use for an Ackie monitor. These guys deserve a big enclosure. They are very crazy. They are very insane. My adults are all in 6 by 2.5 by 4 foot enclosures. They really enjoy them, and I recommend getting this size. I would go nothing less than 5 by 2.5 by 3, but if you can go bigger, highly recommended. Besides the sizing, it also doesn't have many ideal factors for Ackie monitors. Number one, you can't get much substrate depth in there, which is very important for humidity requirements of these guys. Additionally, humidity on that subject, we have a screen top. Now you can make this more humidity proof, but it's very difficult, especially with a top opening breeder tank. You could get a front opening one, and that would probably be a lot more ideal, but it's still very difficult to seal off the top. Lastly, this is all glass here, and while that's maybe not the end of the world, there will be a lot of glass surfing, and there will be a lot of stress that your Ackie monitor will endure by not having the protection of some sides that can act as a visual barrier. Yes, there is glass here, but it is definitely not as big of a deal, especially because down there, that's where the substrate is. I leave some inches between the top of this substrate barrier here and where the actual substrate is, so when they're running around down there, they don't get peeved out by me running around doing my little thing in here. So yes, there are many reasons not to use a 40-gallon breeder, and it is definitely not a long-term and viable solution. This is definitely not something you want to have as a permanent home for these guys. But hey, Prof, you said at the beginning of this that 40 gallons can work in some situations, and I'm sure you already got a hint of when those situations are, and that's number one, when you first maybe get your Ackie monitor and it's a baby. You might want to keep more of an eye on it, or you might not have the enclosure quite ready. Now, I am not as big of an advocate for getting an Ackie monitor before you have a viable enclosure ready, but I know this is not realistic, and I'm trying to be more realistic for you guys here and not hold as high standards as I hold for my guys. And I would also be pretty hypocritical. I mean, I got a 40-gallon right there with a baby in it, and another 40-gallon down there with a bunch of babies in it. So if I told you guys not to use them even temporarily like I am, you know, that would not come off that great. Do note though, guys, that, you know, I have been keeping Ackies for about half a decade now, breeding them, studying every little aspect about them, and I'm not a new keeper, so I kind of understand some things about them that someone who hasn't had an Ackie before probably wouldn't understand right away. So I can keep them a little bit better in these type of glass enclosures like your typical 40-gallon breeder. Now, like I said, I'm not going to stop you guys from doing it and keeping them in there temporarily, especially as babies. I'd never put an adult in one, and it definitely isn't a long-term solution. I can't stress that enough. This is probably the third time in the video I said it. So I think the best way to go about this moving forward is, instead of just purely saying you should go with a bigger enclosure off the bat, which you should, and I give incentives to people who have a proper ready enclosure when they get a baby from me, I want to tell you guys how to keep them in glass tanks, 40-gallon enclosures like this right here, temporarily, and keep them in prime condition and not have them come out with issues if you need to do that while you're getting their permanent home set up. For one, a front opening 40-gallon is going to be a lot better than a top opening one. It's going to make keeping humidity in so much better. So get one of these Exoterras or whatever, the 40-gallon ones. As long as it opens from the front, that's going to be so much better than opening from the top. Especially as the top ones get more worn, it gets harder and harder to open them. The 40-gallon I have to like move it back and forth, and it's just really annoying. So my tip one is to get a front opening enclosure. An additional mention I want to make about these top opening 40-gallon enclosures, or any of the ones that are top opening, the glass ones, is that it makes it hard for you to really measure the basking temp and the UVB if you have a solar meter or something like that, because you really can't get in there and get under there to use this IR gun or whatever without opening it up so you can actually get in there. It's really hard to get a measurement. Additionally, it's kind of not good for working with what in most cases for Ackies is a baby Ackie, and you're trying to tame them because you're coming over top. We all know they don't like that. I've mentioned that in various taming videos. Reminds them of birds of prey, and it's just not very appealing to them. So definitely a front opening one is super beneficial if you're going with a glass enclosure temporarily. Tip 2 is try to work in as much substrate depth as you can. It's going to be really hard, even with saran wrapping your top, to keep humidity in. That's probably the #1 issue, and it leads to really, really rough sheds and backed up sheds, which can be problematic for years. Get as much substrate in here as you can. This is probably something I have in this enclosure that could be much deeper. This does have a layer of dampness though. It might be hard to see on camera. You can see the top couple inches is a little bit drier, and then it gets more and more wet down, especially on the cooler end over here. But if you could even go about 1/3 of the way up even, you know, that would be totally fine. You want to give them some climbing ability like I have here for this guy in this 40 gallon. But substrate depth, it's really important, especially in these situations, because air humidity is just not going to hold that well as it would in a more sealed enclosure like this PVC one over here. Heck, I have LG in a 4x2x3 temporarily right now because I have these enclosures from Dragon House that I'm going to be building. And this substrate in here, which is about 1 foot, isn't really deep enough. Well, it could be work. It could work. There are people, plenty of people, who have 1 foot of substrate and have perfect sheds. I kind of misrepresented that. It's a lot more difficult, I want to say, than, let's say, the amount of substrate depth I have in my 6x2.5x4 foot enclosures, where it's about like 18 inches. There's much more of a wet gradient. It doesn't need as much added moisture, and that's kind of leading into my 3rd tip, is that for the less amount of substrate you have, which you'll have in smaller size enclosures like these 40 gallons I have here, you're going to need to add more moisture more frequently. But you also don't want to flood it, because that can happen quite a bit. I've flooded some enclosures, not flooded, but the water will hang a little bit, and you want to make sure you don't do that too much, because it just leads to more problems and can form mold and different elements that are just not healthy to your reptile, any reptile. Now, I know I mentioned this one, but let's mention it in an official capacity. Saran wrapping the lid where you have a mesh lid, so that's pretty much any glass enclosure. You want to do that with tape. You want to make it as thorough as possible, really. You just want to make room for your bulb, which you're going to have somewhat like this, and your UVB. That can be pretty difficult to cut out that little spot for them to put in there, and also not let out all the humidity. It's really not that easy to do. Yes, it'll keep in some humidity, but I don't know. It's a very difficult task. Additionally, if you have a top like this, which a lot of the front opening ones do, it gets even more difficult, especially when you're trying to do UVB bars, which is much better than the bulb UVB. I have bulb UVB right there because I'm waiting on a bulb to come in for tube. But basically, you know, it's going to be going across the top there, not sitting directly on the mesh, so it's going to be hard to really line up the saran wrap. Now, I don't saran wrap the top of these enclosures because these are super temporary in my case. They're just housed in these until I ship them off. The longest they're in there is during the winter when I'm waiting on warmer weather for them to come out, which, you know, usually I get within a month of them being hatched, a window to ship out. Additionally, these guys, well, in the future, the babies, they're going to be going in LG's 4x2x3 right there because, you know, like I said, LG is going in one of the Dragon House enclosures, which is the proper size. So this is really the baby enclosure. I'm not even going to really be using these in the future, but, you know, in this case I am, and I just wanted to present to you how it is viable in some cases. Finally, guys, I have one more tip for you, and that is to create any visual barriers you can. We have a visual barrier here for this Ackie that blocks him or her off from seeing us come into the garage. Sudden movement of swinging that door open sometimes scares this little one, so I put that barrier there. And then, I mean, I could put barriers in the back there and on the side there, but I mean, this Grow Tent acts kind of a little bit as a barrier, and then we have that wall there. Probably could benefit from putting something up. But if you could do that on 3 sides, some sort of barrier. I know a lot of these 40 gallons come with some sort of backing. Now, they can be somewhat problematic because an Ackie could kind of wedge themselves in as a baby, which sometimes is annoying, but that might be beneficial to keep in or you could do just something little like this, like putting in a plank of wood just so they can't really see out of it. That's my last tip for you. Anyway, guys, that's all I have for you today. I'm going to hang out with this little one now, and I will see you guys in the next video. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. I'd really appreciate it. See you in the next video, guys. Say bye, John. Oh, he's waving. He's waving.